Hello, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm Dave Chancellor, and I'll be your host. For today's webinar, we're going to be hearing about measuring how social relationships contribute to the outcomes of program participants. And we have a great panel of guests who are going to be talking about this with us. So we'll be hearing from Philip Graham, Maureen Berner, Laura Erickson, and Megan Smith. And I'll introduce each of our speakers in just a moment, but first I want to recognize that obviously our world looks a lot different today with COVID-19 than it did just a few months ago when we began planning this webinar. So I want to thank everyone who's making the time to join us here and also acknowledge the many folks who are out there in caretaking or service roles and just thank them for the work that they're doing. We had almost 2,000 people register for this webinar today, which under the best of circumstances would give me sort of concerns about bandwidth issues. So a couple of things you can do to help. So first, be patient with us. If you're seeing lags or drops in sound quality, I'm in my living room right now, and a lot of us are kind of working off of home Wi-Fi networks, so we'll see how it goes. But second, if you're logged in on more than one device or in multiple browser windows, I ask that you close all but one of those so that everyone who wants to join the webinar today is able to. But with that, I'm especially grateful to our speakers today. Dr. Philip Graham is Director of the Center on Social Determinants, Risk Behaviors, and Prevention Science at RTI International. Dr. Maureen Berner is with the NC Impact Initiative and is a professor in the School of Government at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Laura Erickson is an analyst at the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services. And Dr. Megan Smith is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and in the Child Study Center at the Yale School of Medicine and in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Yale School of Public Health. So thanks to all of you for being here today. And I also want to thank the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services for their support of this webinar series. And much of the work that we'll be hearing about today is actually connected to a major ASPE initiative on social capital and social networks. So I guess we're doubly thankful to them today for that. A couple of quick notes on our agenda. We have an hour today, so in just a bit, I'll turn it over to Philip, Maureen, Laura, and Megan. Their presentation should take about the first 45 minutes or so. And then we'll save the final 15 minutes for your questions. You can type those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, as many of you are already doing, and we'll get to as many as we can. And so with that, Philip, Maureen, Laura, and Megan, thank you again for being here. And Philip, I believe you'll be leading us off, so welcome.
Good afternoon. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar and thank the Institute for Research on Poverty for hosting today's webinar. I'd also like to thank you for participating in this time of uncertainty. And given this unique situation, I also wanted to make sure that today's webinar was reflective of our current environment and public health crisis. As you can imagine, COVID-19 has fundamentally impacted and changed how and where we do our work. And it's become abundantly clear to us that social capital strategies have an important role both now and beyond the crisis. Next slide, please. So for example, individuals who are faced with COVID-19 self-isolation may be able to use social capital to better combat that social isolation, access basic resources, but also hopefully endure the economic crisis. So today we are excited to have the opportunity to present a webinar based on work being conducted by RTI International, UNC School of Government, and being funded by ASPE. And so today's agenda will include what does it look like to understand social capital, using logic models, measuring social capital measurement and action, and how do we get started with a set of action steps and resources. And hopefully we will have enough time at the end of today's webinar for you to ask your questions. I'd also like to acknowledge the overall project that is funded by ASPE, which is the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation. Today's webinar is based on a series of project activities that included a comprehensive program scan to identify human service organizations who use social capital components, even if they didn't necessarily use the term social capital. We also receive input from social capital experts, including federal staff, researchers, and practitioners. And this also culminated in the conduct of case studies and site visits to programs using social capital tenets to improve participant outcomes. So what is social capital? We've defined it in this project as the connections, networks, or relationships among people and the value that arises from them. Well, more specifically, there are 3 types of social capital that we're going to talk about today, and they include the following: what we call bonding, bridging, and linking. Bonding really refers to the relationships among individuals with characteristics, experiences, and group memberships in common. But for today, we want you to think about the following. Do your program participants need to stay connected to those who similarly situated to each other or to get by? Bridging social capital really refers to relationships built among individuals, communities, or groups with differing background characteristics or group memberships. And again, putting this in context, do your program participants need connections between social groups, social class, race, religion, or other important demographics that allow them to get ahead? And the final concept is called linking social capital, which is really an extension of bridging social capital, but it really focuses on networks and organizations that provide connections across power dynamics, giving access to more resources. And again, to think about this in context, do your program participants need relationships with people or institutions in positions of power? But why do we care about social capital, and why do we want to understand its impact and how it impacts lives? Research shows that people with high social capital find better jobs and are happier and healthier. But how does that occur? And one of the things we're interested in is it things like shared information, emotional and financial support, or really increased chances of finding better employment. But also, how can we replicate those aspects within human services programs and organizations? And then how do we know when we see it? Later in today's webinar, you will learn more about social capital measurement. And this is important because social capital measurements allow us to do a couple of things. One, better monitoring of social capital performance, and also provide data feedback into the system to facilitate program improvements. And last but not least, it allows us for better measurement to inform decision makers, provide funders with concrete return on investment, and really look at impact indicators. I do apologize for our technical glitch, but I want to again thank you for participating in today's webinar, and I want to turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Maureen Brenner, who's really going to take you through a social capital logic model development process. Maureen, I'll let you take it over from here.
Great. Thank you, Philip, and I really appreciate it. My role in this webinar is to talk about how you can actually build in social capital into a logic model that describes what you're doing with your program. So what we want to do is be able to say that we can actually build in social capital strategically and intentionally into how we plan out our programs, and then that's going to help us with measurement and understanding whether or not we're getting the bang we want for the effort we're putting into it. Now, all of you out there are interested in this in terms of how we can make our programs run better. What we wanted to point out is that through our research, we know that if we have a goal like economic mobility and well-being, we have programs that build skills, we have programs that can connect folks with jobs, but we also have social capital, and that can serve as its own particular pathway to leading to economic mobility and well-being, as well as being incorporated into standard programs. So we really think you can be very intentional about pursuing a social capital model to get to these particular goals. So that's what I want to walk through with you. Well, I teach a regular stats class to graduate students, and they sometimes think logic models just sound very formal. I'm like you, I'm stuck at home, and I'm trying to keep up with my work, but also deal with kids and all these other things. And I was actually doing some baking, and I thought logic models are actually like a recipe in a lot of ways. Logic models formally have space for us to describe resources, activities, outputs, and outcomes. It's really an A to B to C to D sort of path. Well, it's just like a recipe in the sense that I have ingredients that I'm bringing to the table. I'm going to do something. I'm going to mix them up in a particular way. I'm going to prepare it in a particular way. Hopefully, if I put something in the oven and I take it out, I get what I expect. And ultimately, the reason I'm doing this whole process, is to sit down with my family at night and have a good dinner and make that connection. So to me, that was just a way in which I put this process into my day-to-day life that we're all dealing with. Let me walk through these individual options with you. Resources that you would have in a logic model, we really are having to list out everything that's going to go into it. The tools we need, like staff, volunteers, money, equipment, space, workspace, play space. Anything that you need to make your plan work has to come from somewhere. And those are the resources that we're putting into our programs. The activities are what you're doing with those resources. There has to be a link between the resources and the activities. So to get to the idea about improving economic mobility, some of the activities you may be working with are events, specific trainings on interviewing, job fairs, a mentorship program, or a peer support group. And that's an example I'm going to come back to in just a second. We also have, then the next step is once you take those resources, you do those activities, what comes out of that? What is sort of accomplished or produced? And this is where especially it becomes important because you can think about the measurement right away. You can say, we actually did this thing, 3 job fairs, or we had a peer group meet and started to function independently over a period of time. But that's not where we should stop. Our whole goal is to make a difference. So that's where we need to explicitly tie what we're putting in with what we're doing, with what's coming out, to have the ultimate outcome or impact. And that's where you can say, wow, we've reached our goal, like people in jobs, or people in jobs that then let them have stable housing. Let me show you how this actually comes together and that you can work with. What you see in front of you is a blank logic model. And this is one that is specifically sort of structured to deal with social capital. So lots of logic models are out there on the internet. You can probably find a gazillion of them. And they all have different shape boxes and different arrows. But they all have these main components. In terms of what we're talking about today, our first box is the social capital inputs. The second box is the social capital activities. The third is the social capital outputs. And when I keep saying social capital, it's because we're talking about everything as it relates to building trust, relationships, and making connections. There's 3 particular things I want to highlight when you're looking at a logic model, and that is the final column of outcomes. You know, we don't run our programs and then expect people's lives to be changed overnight. I mean, that would be wonderful, but we know the reality is that we're in it for the long term and for permanent changes and improvements. So we have to understand our outcomes can be short term, intermediate term, and then the long-term goal we're trying to achieve. I also want to point out that in the brown boxes, social capital programs usually don't exist in a vacuum. We know that there's other things going on that are non-social capital programs, inputs, activities, other things. We just need to acknowledge that that's going on along with our focused work. And finally, we need to include what assumptions we're working with and what context. Let me turn very quickly to an example that I sort of filled out just to give you a flavor for this. I hope there are some cooks out there who appreciate all of my bad cooking related puns. In terms of inputs and resources that we are putting in, let's say we want to set up a peer support group for folks who are looking for jobs because they've been laid off due to the current shutdown. And we want to provide a social capital peer support group to make connections to get through the crisis. We have staff, volunteers, participants. You know, the organization we work with may have its own assets like reputation or a structure by which something like a peer support group can be put together. In a normal world, we'd have a room reserved at the community center and folks would set a time to meet there, and that's where we would see that bonding social capital be made that Philip was talking about. And we might have other structures where we can do the bridging and linking social capital. Well, to me, the value of the logic model is really pretty cool because I can say, well, you know, my plan isn't working right now because I'm stuck at home. Well, how could I pivot using this same model into our current world? Well, maybe the resources that could be brought to the table might be instead that the organization has an IT person who could set up a virtual support group that still meets on a regular basis. Or maybe the individuals have a resource that's just their phone and they can set up a chat group that they use to connect on a regular basis. We can think about different ways to approach developing social capital with different resources and maybe different takes on the activities. We're still hoping for the same outputs. We're still hoping for the same outcomes. Like a short-term outcome may be giving people some confidence that things will get better, that when one door shuts, another opens, and that there's new opportunities so that they can share information about maybe this place is laying off, but this other place is hiring. We can think about intermediate term outcomes where folks can actually step into one of those new opportunities and gain some job experience that's new, which makes them more employable once this all goes past. Ultimately, we're hoping for that long-term idea of it's not just a job, it's not just building that experience, it's actually creating a stable family environment, which lets them get all sorts of other benefits in their life. Now, I just also want to quickly point out we have assumptions that, you know, here I have that the program is voluntary. We might assume, well, we assume everybody has a phone, maybe, that they can use. That's a logic model lets us lay it out where people can question our assumptions and they can question the context. And the context here, obviously, I had neighborhood characteristics, but you know, our context right now is a context that nobody's dealt with, but we can deal with it explicitly in a logic model. So to wrap up, what I want to say is that we have to be flexible. Logic models can help us with that. When I talk to my kids, I tell them just because you have to stand 6 feet apart doesn't mean you stop talking. It means you've got to speak up. right? And you still have to make that connection. And with that, I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you so much, Maureen. I'm really excited to be here today, and I think that's a perfect segue into how to measure social capital, since a logic model can really highlight, as you said, the things that you might want to measure in your program. Our Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS was really interested in this question of how do you measure social capital. So we talked to HHS leadership, program staff, and human services programs on the ground to really determine, why would we want to measure social capital and figure out, are people already doing this work? And kind of across the board and in the number of conversations we had, people really agreed that it's important to measure social capital to see how it impacts program outcomes. And as Dave, Philip, and Maureen have all touched on, I think we all recognize that now, perhaps more than ever, social capital connections are really important. But we just also want to recognize that it's a challenging time for people to be thinking about expending more resources in a different way. So I just want to acknowledge that as we jump in to talking about measuring social capital. But one of the main things that we've learned from all of our conversations that I mentioned was that there's no one best way or single method for capturing the bonding, bridging, and linking aspects of social capital that Philip mentioned. So if you're trying to think about how to measure social capital, you'll really want to think about what context you're dealing with. So for example, if you run a peer support program for survivors of domestic violence and you're trying to build connections between survivors, you might want to ask questions to capture that bonding social capital. Or conversely, if you are a reentry program serving folks reentering from incarceration, maybe you're trying to help folks reestablish damaged ties with friends and family. So that would be, another kind of social capital question. So while there's no one best way to measure it, we've found that questions seem to fall into three main categories. So this first type is kind of measuring access to social capital and having someone to turn to in an emergency. So I think, of course, that might be more important now than ever, and that's kind of what a lot of us are thinking about. So these kinds of questions might ask someone, do you have someone to rely on for childcare in an emergency? Or if you're in a pinch, do you have someone from whom you can borrow money? Another type of question asks about trust. So asking people, do you trust your neighbors, or do you have someone who you can talk to about your problems? And the third type of typical question that we see is trying to measure people's level of civic and community engagement. So that could be asking people if they vote, if they volunteer in their community, or if they have a library card. So those are just three general categories that we've heard about. But there are a number of things that you'd want to consider when you're thinking, which type of question should we be asking? So one thing that I think is really important, while we are focusing kind of today on positive social capital, I just want to recognize that social capital can be negative if it's reinforcing existing networks that exclude marginalized individuals. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're measuring social capital. Your participant characteristics are also something really important to consider when figuring out how to ask about social capital. So for example, if you're serving a population with many challenges, maybe individuals who are using substances or who are experiencing homelessness, in that case, it's going to be really important to assess social capital over an extended period of time. Because if someone's coming into a substance use recovery program or seeking shelter, then they've probably already depleted all their social capital resources and have already tapped into their networks. So it's just important to keep that in mind as we're asking about social capital, just to keep in mind that we need to assess it over a longer period of time in those circumstances, most likely. And then you also are going to want to think about why your program wants to measure social capital as you're deciding kind of how and when to measure it. So the way that you collect data is really going to depend on what your goals of measuring it are. So for example, if you want to see if your programming is actually building social capital, in that case, you might randomly assign participants to different social capital building activities to see which ones are making the most difference. Or if you're trying to look at how social capital impacts other program outcomes, you're going to want to assess social capital not just when people come into the program and not just when they finish the program, but also perhaps 6 months after completion as you're measuring your other outcomes. And then finally, think about unintended consequences of measurement. So kind of an example that we heard anecdotally was a program asked case managers to begin documenting their interactions with clients. But in some cases, that caused the case managers to focus more on documentation rather than on building meaningful relationships. So of course, that's something that we want to avoid. And in those kinds of cases, you might want to think about providing additional staff training or just talking to staff about keeping in mind that the clients are the main priority. And then I just wanted to quickly share 2 examples that we've seen of how folks are measuring social capital. So one is this is an HHS program, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program. So one of their priorities is ensuring that youth have permanent connections with supportive adults in their lives. So for their transitional living program, which provides long-term residential services for homeless youth, they ask participants if they have someone in their life, a mentor or a responsible adult who pays attention to what's going on. So that's a thing that they're already collecting that we think really gets at social capital. And then we also talked to the Family Independence Initiative. This is not an HHS program, but it's a cohort program that partners with low-income families to kind of help them leverage their social capital. And they have a really innovative online platform called Up Together. So families complete these monthly journals online, and they answer questions about how much help they gave and received in any given month. And folks estimate how much that help that they gave or received was worth. So for example, if they babysat for a neighbor for free for an hour, then maybe that was worth $10, and they would put that in their online journal. And FAI uses these data to demonstrate the economic impact of these social capital exchanges. So for example, in the Boston and Cambridge area, FAI families exchanged nearly $2 million of social capital from 2010 to 2018. And speaking of innovative examples, I'm really excited to now turn it over to Dr. Megan Smith, whose program is a really great example of how to strategically and innovatively use social capital data.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Pleasure to be here with all of you virtually. And I wanted to start by just providing a brief overview, very brief overview of the Moms Partnership, and specifically just to note to you that this is our theory of change, a bit, this is a broad, high-level theory of change, but similar to what Maureen was discussing. And our focus is on improving the mental health of low-income mothers, pregnant and parenting caregivers. And social capital really undergirds our theory of change in that we are improving mental health, reducing depressive symptoms, with the overall objective of improving economic and social mobility. So social capital both conceptualized as an outcome, but also as a mechanism whereby we can improve mental health and improve economic mobility. I wanted to just briefly touch on our 2 main interventions. One is called stress management and uses cognitive behavioral therapy, 8 sessions of cognitive behavioral therapy that are 90 minutes each, delivered in a group setting, so really promoting that bonding social capital, as well as linking to other groups of mothers. Our other intervention is called Parenting Dance, which is a dyadic parent-child interactive intervention that is 8 weeks in a group session as well that uses video feedback. And both of these interventions are delivered in a socially promoting, connecting context that we call a hub location, which can be sources of community-level social capital, so for example, supermarkets, public libraries. We also deliver all of these interventions using clinicians, but also a position that we call a community mental health ambassador, which is a woman from the community who we train to deliver the intervention alongside clinicians to make the intervention culturally relevant and tailored and provide meaningful real-world examples of the intervention. I wanted to provide you with some specific concrete ways that we've operationalized the measurement of social capital in the program that really combines some traditional measures of social support and social networks, but also try to take into account how you might think about collective community-level measures of social capital. The first 3 bullet points here are measures that we've adapted from the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods, which was really a social ecological study of adult crime and substance use disorder and violence, and measure different conceptualizations of neighborhood and environment. The last bullet that you see there, the Williams Internet Social Capital Scale, is something that we used with some mobile applications, mobile interventions using mobile phones as a wraparound to our in-person services. And we really tried to understand how social capital developed in virtual platforms. Particular to how we measured community support, we were measuring the extent to which both adolescents and their caregivers, their parents, felt comfortable asking advice from people in their neighborhoods and interacting with them. So this is on a 5-point scale. For example, if I needed advice about something, I could go to someone in my neighborhood, or I felt comfortable asking someone to borrow food. So the collective efficacy measure that we used was really measuring informal social control and people's willingness to intervene. So for example, if children were spray painting graffiti on a local building, how likely is it that one of your neighbors would do something about it or intervene? We measured things like reciprocal exchange, so that really trust and reciprocity, but the frequency of social exchange within neighborhoods and the consequences to children. So how often do you and someone in your community or your neighborhood do favors for each other? For example, watching each other's children. And what's been interesting is we, in our work, we're scaling the Moms Partnership across the United States right now and working particularly with the TANF, or Welfare Cash Assistance Program, in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that we heard from our clinicians and our community ambassadors and staff and DC moms was that they actually were seeing qualitatively how social capital was being built in the bonding, bridging, and linking format, but they weren't really feeling like we were capturing some of those dimensions whereby it was changing in the moms group. So these questions, these two questions you see here, were really taken from an instrument that was actually initially developed to look at social support and networks and connections among elderly populations. But in DC, our group actually took these questions and adapted them to really get at these concepts of belongingness and longing for a sense of belonging into a community. And so we really co-constructed some questions together to measure both bonding and bridging social capital as a result of the moms group. One thing I wanted to note that's really been a challenge for us around social capital measurement, and these are data from 64 participants in one of our programs where we looked at different measures of social support and also social capital. But one thing we struggled with is really the sensitivity to change of our measures. And so trying to understand, are the measures we're using really sensitive to change from an intervention that's designed to promote social capital? And so I think, Philip mentioned this, and, thinking about things that can change and you can measure in the short term and the longer term. And we're still trying to understand for our program really how far out we need to think about measuring social capital. And then again, thinking about the sensitivity to change. One way that we've thought about this is actually using something we call digital biomarkers. So in the mobile phone app that I mentioned, we did a study where we created a virtual community we called Mamba, which is the graph on the left, and then we also had a control group where we just gave them a phone. And you can see there are differences, actually statistically significant differences in intervention control. But we were exploring using some passive data collected from participants' phones. So for example, thinking about how GPS coordinates around movement might be related to measures of social capital. We know they're measured, for example, to measures of depression. But we used some passive data collection, and there are other opportunities, I think, there to really think about what you can collect on mobile phones and devices to measure social capital. We also used the Williams Internet Social Capital Scale here, where we did see really people's sense of belonging to a community changing over the course of the intervention. And I wanted to just conclude by giving you some quotes, because one of the things that we've really found around measurement of social capital in our program is the benefit from both qualitative data and empirically based data. And this is an example of a participant talking about really finding balance and being able to talk to and meet different people that came out of the moms group. So that bonding, but also that bridging social capital that emerged. And I thought this was a particularly interesting quote about not only the value that the groups bring to mothers involved in the group, but the larger value that the groups bring to the community in terms of volunteering. So we have graduations at the end of every mom's session, and this is a clinician. At recent graduation from the Mom Stress Management class, the room was just filled with love. There were children of participants from ages 0 to 13 in the room. There were fathers who were there in support of their partners. Some long-lost friends were present as participants reconnected with them after the final class, which was focused on networks of support. Graduation also had volunteers who wanted to contribute their time to support the MOMS program. So I think this really talks about volunteerism and altruism that are often correlated with measures of social capital. So thank you for your time today. I wanted to turn it back over to Laura.
Thanks so much, Megan. I think that was a really great example of kind of best practices. And for folks who are wondering, how do we get to that point, I think we have some ideas for some action steps that you might be able to take next. So one of the first things that you're going to want to think about is kind of figure out where are you on this kind of continuum of data collection. So for example, are you just now getting started thinking about collecting data on social capital? Maybe you're already in the process of picking up data on social capital and other activities, or maybe you even have a really well-established system that you already use. And as we're thinking about this, I do also want to again note that many of us are prioritizing COVID-19 response right now. But I think we can at least think about next steps for folks to take when you're ready to kind of begin this process or move forward in this process. So for those of you who are just getting started in this work, I think one important thing to do is just start by documenting things like who are you serving right now? What activities are you doing to build social capital? The idea is to kind of get a baseline or kind of a sense of what your starting point is so that you can later measure change in outcomes over time. So for example, you might want to start by thinking some of those questions that we talked about earlier that you could use to measure social capital and kind of decide what aspects of it that you really want to capture and how that might best fit with your program. And then you can also begin by doing just what Maureen talked about and kind of either developing a logic model in general or specifically a social capital focused logic model for how social capital activities impact your program outcomes. For those of you who are already in the process of gathering data on relationships, I think the key is to kind of focus on understanding any changes that you're seeing from that baseline data, from that starting point that you already have a sense of if you're in the middle of gathering data. So, this can help you figure out if you're already meeting your social capital building expectations. But if you're not, you can start to think about how to make process improvements. So, for example, if you have that logic model that maps out how you expect social capital to impact participant outcomes, you can compare your logic model and kind of your hypothetical of how you think your program will work and kind of compare that to how the program is actually working on the ground and kind of think about, are there differences? Are there areas where this process isn't working well? You might want to consider ways to improve your ability to leverage and build and leverage social capital for program outcomes. And finally, if you're already using a well-established data gathering system, you can really focus on measuring outcomes that Maureen talked about. So, really getting to the true goals of your program and find out, is our work helping to reduce poverty, helping to reduce depression, things like that. So this is going to require a higher level of organizational capacity than the previous two categories because to really get at outputs, you're probably going to need to do things like potentially be in touch with program alums or to have updated contact information on all your participants and former participants so that you can continue to gather data over time. And you're probably going to want someone, for example, either on your staff or someone who you can partner with who really understands and can analyze data. But once you're able to do this, you can really leverage this data to your advantage. And the data can, again, show you areas where you might need to improve. So, maybe, for example, you might see that your social capital activities aren't having the impact that you expected on, for example, participants' employment. So maybe you need to improve your connections with employers in the area. But you can also use this outcome data to communicate with funders and show, our program has these awesome impacts, or, we have great impacts in this area, but we think we need someone to fund some work in this other area where we need a little bit of assistance. So, this might seem a little bit overwhelming, but I just would say no matter where you are in the process, there are at least small steps that you can take forward toward improving your data collection process. And to that end, I just wanted to point out a few resources that we have. So this website here has all of ASPE's social capital resources, including a lot of what we have talked about today and much more. You can also email me. Here's my email here, Laura Erickson at hhs.gov on the slide, with questions or if you just want to be kept in the loop on future work that we might be doing. And then just to call out a few resources in particular from that site that might be of interest, we have a little one-pager infographic. It's kind of a Social Capital 101 that defines what social capital is and gives some quick examples. It's very visual. Second, we have a practitioner tool that's a lot of what Maureen covered. It goes into a deeper dive on how to use logic models for social capital. So it has a brief, and it also has a blank Word document that you can download. It has that blank template that Maureen covered, so you can fill that in for your own program. And then third, we have a measurement brief, which covers a lot of the information that I discussed earlier, including some more in-depth considerations that you might want to think about when deciding whether to measure social capital and some more examples of how to do it. And with that, I will just turn it back to Dave to guide us through some questions, I think.